where you kind of went your kind of personal allowance was taken away, and then you went back to 40%, and then above 150,000 you went back to it would have been 45% in England, but the top rate threshold to reduce that so that it's kind of more consistent with when the personal allowance gets tapered off, and then as well as the kind of 41 and 46% bands, introducing a new income tax band of 44% between 75,000 and the new top rate threshold, and freezing the intermediate rate threshold, which £25,689 per year, and then also increasing the higher rate, that new band between 75 and 125,000, and the top rate by 2p. So that creates a marginal rate structure of 43% higher rate, the new rate of 46, and then top rate 48%. So basically quite a few increases to income tax, which are quite progressive. I'll show some distributional graph on that in a minute. Council tax, just a kind of basic revenue raiser towards the top end, increasing by £100 a year for bands F, G and H, the top bands. Land and buildings transaction tax, various increases in the rates and a surcharge for overseas entities and non-UK residents buying property, and the land and buildings transaction tax additional dwelling supplement, increasing or doubling it from 4% to 8%, and also an increase in the Scottish landfill tax by 30%. Now, the overall revenue, the overall estimated, oh yeah, I've got one more slide here on the actual marginal rate structure. This shows you on income tax, the blue line is kind of the system as it was in 2022-23, and the red line shows you the proposed reforms. So you can see a reduction in the intermediate rate threshold, a reduction in the higher rate threshold, and then those kind of higher rates and the new rate kicking in above 40,000, and then 75,000, 125,000, 140. So the revenue projections, this is revenue raised per year in millions of pounds. So income tax 867 million, then around 70 million from the council tax increase, about 240 million from the land and buildings transaction tax, and then another 100 or so from the additional dwelling supplement, and a bit from Scottish landfill tax. So total kind of short-term revenue raising, we reckoned just over 1.3 billion pounds extra revenue a year. So fairly large sum in the Scottish context, I think. But we wanted to raise even more than that to provide a kind of a better base with which to kind of fund public service improvements into the future. So there's a second set of recommendations. Most of these are kind of additional to what's been shown before, but in one case, it's an alternative to what's already been shown, a sort of better longer term alternative. I'll explain that in a minute. So these, we think these could be in place by 2026-27 at the latest, if they were kind of implemented this year. The most ambitious reform is an annual wealth tax on household assets above £1 million. So that's financial and property wealth, and I think pension wealth as well, at the summed at the household level. That's implemented as a local tax. The reason for that is that the Scottish government doesn't currently have power to implement a national wealth tax, but it could implement a new wealth tax at the local level. The current legislation appears to give it the sort of jurisdiction to do that. The rates of the wealth tax would be 0.5% marginal rate on wealth between £1 and £2 million. So people with wealth below 1 million wouldn't pay anything. 2 million to 5 million would be a marginal rate of 1%, and then 5 million and above a marginal rate of 2%, and that's annual, right, rather than a one-off wealth tax. So as well as wealth tax, the second big reform is replacing the council tax with a proportional property tax. Now, this is a reform that has been kind of popularised by the campaign group Fairer Share in England originally, but actually, because the structure of the council tax system in Scotland is fairly similar to England, it works pretty well as a reform in Scotland as well. And so you'd get rid of current council tax under this proposal and replace it with a proportional property tax at an annual rate of 0.6% a year for primary residences. So if your house was assessed at, I don't know, 100,000, you'd be paying like 600,000 a year. You'd be paying 600 a year, I guess. And then if it was a second home, you'd pay double to kind of disincentivize second home ownership. So 1.2% for second homes per year. They're the biggest revenue raisers in this set. There's then other taxes, other tax options as well. Reducing expenditure on the small business bonus scheme by 25%. That's kind of saving money on expenditure rather than raising more tax. But there's been some evaluation of the small business bonus scheme by, I think, Fraser Allender Institute that indicated it wasn't necessarily achieving its original objectives particularly effectively. So we felt that it was somewhere where a part of the system where money could be saved. Non-domestic rates, replace or supplement them with a land value tax on commercial land. That would require valuations of land, but you'd need to do revaluations of property for the proportional property tax anyway. And the wealth tax would require some valuations as well. So in fact, a lot of these valuations could be done at the same time or in a similar kind of framework. Increase the Scottish aggregates levy by 30% and introduce a local carbon emissions tax on land holdings exceeding 1,000 hectares. So the revenue projections for those longer term reforms, as I say, the biggest components, these are the wealth tax, which we project to raise just over 1.4 billion a year, and the proportional property tax, which raises just under £500 million a year, 450 million. And then you've got the other components. Land value tax is hard to estimate the yield, so we go with kind of 100 million as a reasonable, 100 million a year as a reasonable figure on commercial property. And so longer term reforms only just under 2.1 billion a year. When you add that to what's raised by the short-term reforms, taking out the council tax increases from the short term because they've been replaced with proportional property tax in the longer term, you get 3.3 billion just over per year. And that's enough. Working out that in the context of the public sector workforce, for example, it's enough to raise public sector salaries by an across-the-board 12% on top of any increase that's already been agreed in current budgets. So 12% by itself would only be just above CPI inflation, but 12% plus the increases that people are already getting is a reasonable kind of reasonably large real terms pay increase for most workers anyway. I've got two slides on distributional impacts just to show what's going on there. This is impacts by income. So what I've done here is taken Scottish households in terms of their net income, allowing for family size from decile 1, which is the poorest on the left-hand side, and up to all the way over to decile 10, which is the richest 10% of households on the right-hand side. And the vertical axis shows the average percentage change in annual net income arising from the set of reforms that we're able to model in this way. That's like individual reforms that impact individuals and households. It's hard to model things like landfill tax in this way because it's not clear what the incidence of that is on households. So what we've included here is, well, the public sector pay increase has been included just for illustration, and you can see that the biggest percentage impacts of that are sort of middle to sort of 8th decile of the income distribution, 8th and 9th. The income tax changes are very progressive. That's the green bars going right up to the top deciles, losing about 3% on average. The proportional property tax is also progressive, with gainers, average gains in the bottom half and then some average losses in the top half. And then the wealth tax is especially progressive at the top end, with the top decile losing around 20% of net income. Now, obviously, they wouldn't necessarily pay that out of their net income. They might kind of sell assets or liquidate assets to sort of meet that annual bill. It would kind of, different people would do different things to afford those well, that wealth tax, but it does show highly progressive impacts if you take the package as a whole. So this would help equalize the income distribution. And the second slide on distribution effects here shows it would also equalize the wealth distribution. So I've just looked at the proportional property tax and the wealth tax here. And look, so rather than income deciles, this is deciles of wealth. Households are ranged from least wealthy to, on the left-hand side, to most wealthy on the right-hand side. And this is percentage change in annual wealth. So you can see that replacing the council tax with proportional property tax leaves, on average, the sort of bottom third or so of the least wealthy households better off. And then some losses in the top half of the distribution. The wealth tax is really well, as you might expect, is really well targeted in terms of having a big negative impact at the top end. So overall, the package is, at least once you go above the bottom decile, is pretty progressive, with wealthier deciles kind of paying more as a percentage of net wealth. So that's a kind of nice progressive impact of what we can model in this package. So the broad conclusions from the report: there is potential, I find, to fund increased investment in public services in Scotland using a costed package of tax increases. And I say this, I estimate this can raise around £1.3 billion per year for Scottish public services. In the short run, introducing longer term reforms over the next 3 or 4 years would raise an additional £2 billion per year, making £3.3 billion in total. One additional result I didn't talk about earlier, but the package is progressive with respect to gender. It reduces gender inequality in net earnings, and it's also distributionally progressive, measured across the income or the wealth distribution. So it scores well on both those criteria. Finally, I've got one slide. There. Comparison. This is just to compare with what was done in the Scottish government budget that was announced last December, the budget for 2023-24. So the income tax changes, thresholds were frozen, all thresholds, and the higher and top rates were increased by 1p. So we recommended 2p, and they didn't introduce that additional band between 75 and 125,000 we were talking about, but they did increase by 1p in the pound. And there is an overall progressive impact of that policy, which the Scottish government has modelled themselves. They increased the ADS for LBTT to 6%, which was kind of half of the increase. Remember, we recommended 4 to 8%. They went 4 to 6%. And an increase in Scottish landfill tax. Total revenue raised around 550 million. So just less than half of our recommended short-term reforms. So what this says to me is that the current Scottish government's gone kind of part of the way towards the short-term recommendations. Of course, they wouldn't have actually seen the short-term recommendations until sort of very soon before the budget came out, I think. But they're nonetheless moving in the same direction as the short-term recommendations, but not quite as ambitious, or actually, quite a long way short of the level of ambition in this report. But so a good step, a good first step, but kind of more to do would be my personal assessment of the package. And that's all the slides. So I'll kind of stop sharing now. Thanks very much, and I hope I haven't spoken too long. Yeah, that's okay.
Thank you, Howard. That was perfect timing. That was an excellent presentation. I hope people will be a bit familiar with the report already, but you've certainly taken us through it. I think what's interesting as well is not only what we can raise immediately, and people often think about tax, we only think about income tax, and we made it really clear when we looked at the terms of reference for this research that we wanted to think much more widely and much more creatively about how Scotland can go on to fund the services that we need and indeed the people that work there. And looking at the distributional impacts is really important as well, because there's all kinds of unintended consequences that you can trip over when we come to actually changing any of our taxes. You know, Britain has got a very long, complex tax history, like many countries. And, you know, to unpick one part of it, because there's been so much tinkering over the years, other than council tax, which never seems to change ever. Everything else moves quite at different speeds, you know. So I think that looking at the distributional impacts and how that would actually pan out is really, really important. So thank you for taking us through that. The next thing I want to do is just let people know that we are recording the session. So I should have announced that at the beginning. And if you didn't want to be part of that, then if you just pop your camera off and thank you for taking part. What I'll do is announce our panel, and then I'm going to just ask the panel some specific questions, which again, I would ask people to reflect on the comments in the chat, or indeed might prompt further questions from yourself for later. So on the panel with us this evening, we've got 3 people that have joined us, all bringing different areas of expertise to this, in terms of how do we take this work forward and what we do around it, and also some of the modelling behind it. So first of all, Ros Foy has joined us this evening. Ros is the General Secretary of the STUC and leads the organisation and speaks on behalf of all of the workers across Scotland in taking forward our campaigning and lobbying. Also with us this evening is Tracy Darling, who is the Scottish Secretary of Unison Scotland, and Tracy is the largest public sector union in Scotland, Unison Scotland, and I'm delighted that Tracy's with us this evening. Unison Scotland also brought out their own tax report last year as well, which I think if we can add that to the chat would again be essential reading for people. Unison Scotland did a lot of work in actually digging into, again, what type of options there were for tax raising in Scotland and how we can get the government to make sure that local authorities, particularly are funded to deliver the services that they need to. And lastly, joining us as well is David Iser. And previously, David worked at the Fraser Allender Institute, who we just heard mentioned, and I think was no doubt involved in some of the review of the small business scheme. And David has focused previously on working for the Scottish budget, devolved tax policy, and advised the Scottish Parliament's Finance Committee. David has recently moved on and is the Director of Research and Analysis at Consumer Scotland, the new statutory body representing consumers in Scotland. So thank you to our panel this evening. The first question that I have, I'd like to actually ask from David. So, David, I'd like to ask you, what needs to happen legislatively and politically in the next year, for example, in the programme for government, if wealth and property taxes are to become a reality in the near future?
Thank you for that. Can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you for the invitation to join you in this discussion. Really interesting and important report. What needs to happen legislatively and politically on property and wealth taxes, I think was the question. I mean, I think it clearly depends quite a lot on which aspects of the policies that Howard you're talking about. There's sort of different processes involved in different taxes and different changes associated with the different taxes, I think. So if you're talking about something like, if you're talking about council tax, obviously the existing property tax system is basically fully devolved already. Wealth taxes, I think, is very different. I'll talk about that separately. But the existing system of property tax is already devolved. If you're looking at council tax and you're talking about, well, changing the ratios between the bands, which is something that the Scottish Government did back in 2017, what we'd probably be looking at there is, well, we know what would be involved there is an amendment to the 1992 Local Government Finance Act. Would probably be talking about a lead-in time of a couple of years. So it probably wouldn't be something that you would do for the budget next year, the 24-25, but the one after that, I think the government would want to introduce period of consultation and then the secondary legislation, and get it in train for the year after next. That's basically the timescales that were operated to the previous time that happened, where we had a report from the Commission on Land Taxation in 2015, the Scottish Government then prioritising to do this in its 2016 manifesto, and the changes coming in time for the 17-18 budget. Some of the other things around council tax that were mentioned would be potentially more straightforward, so changing reliefs and exemptions around second homes or empty homes. Those could be things I think that could happen in next year's budget. So I'm talking about, of course, the 24-25 budget now. What about some of the bigger things on council tax? Those would take longer, I think. I mean, if you're talking about a revaluation, and revaluation is really important. Clearly, we haven't had one since, was it 91 or 92? Lots of properties almost certainly in the wrong band, quite inequitable system as a result. We'd have to go through a process of agreeing how we were going to do that revaluation. We'd then have to actually do the revaluation, and then we'd have to get the legislative system in place. So Wales did a revaluation in 2003, and then the revalued property bands came into effect in 2005. So again, that gives us a bit of a sense of what would be involved there. But I think it would be an early commitment to explore the sort of technical aspects of how we were going to do the revaluation, what exactly that was going to involve in terms of resources and technological approaches and so on. Stuff on LBTT is generally actually much quicker to implement. And in fact, you know, generally you want to not pre-announce those changes too much in advance, because people do respond very much to how they think the policy is going to change. So there's probably a case there for sort of talking about much shorter timescales, and most of the changes, I think probably all of the changes that Howard mentioned, you could do for the 24-25 budget. Just briefly on wealth tax, I mean, I do think that the issues, there are some really big challenges on wealth tax, both constitutionally and administratively. I mean, I think Howard is definitely correct to say that in theory, if a wealth tax is introduced at a local government level, that's within Scottish government competence in theory, in a way that it's not within competence to introduce a wealth tax at a Scottish level. But I think we'd probably be being optimistic if we thought that the Treasury would think that that was, the UK Treasury was an accepted thing for a local tax. And I think indeed quite hard to sort of make the case that a wealth tax was really local if it wasn't local authorities administering that, collecting those revenues. But you know, is that really possible in practice? So I think there's some really big challenges around wealth tax. As I say, partly on the constitutional side, partly on some of those administrative issues. I mean, who is actually going to set up systems of self-assessment? Who's going to sort of police this system? Really big challenges. I have to say I'm slightly skeptical that that's something that we could implement by 26, 27. And maybe there's an intermediary step to look at devolving aspects of capital gains tax or inheritance tax as a sort of preliminary step in that journey. So that's an initial thought about some of the challenges that might be involved in implementing some of the great suggestions that were made in terms of tax reform on the wealth and property side of things.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
You've outlined there a number of the, the issues that there are, but also I think what we'll need to look at is what is the political will around it, which is what we can obviously do the lobbying around, but we will need to think about, government often come up with good ideas and then civil servants have to implement them with expert input. And that's when things kind of sometimes hit, problems. So knowing in advance what can be done much more quickly, what's going to actually take legislation to do, or indeed secondary legislation to do at a certain stage, is interesting as well for us to think about at this point. You talked there just laterally about local authorities and the importance of things being delivered locally, and that can only really be done through local authorities. So I think it would be helpful to ask Tracy, maybe for her reflections on your own research that you did around tax, but to think more widely, what do you see for public services being the challenges ahead of us? We've just had local authority budget setting, which has been difficult to say the least. And how do you think that we can help take this forward using the tax research? What bits of it would you like to see the government implement?
Thanks, Linda, and thanks again for the invitation to participate in this discussion. And I think very welcome in the context of local government, who have been the poor relation in the public services for far too long. When you consider what it is that they are there to do, it's incredible the extent of Scottish Government reach into local government and the restriction on just how they spend their money. So much of what comes from Scottish Government, and most of council income comes from Scottish Government, doesn't come from council tax. It's barely 15% of what councils have to spend comes from the council tax revenue. So the vast majority comes with what we call strings. It's ring-fenced. It's for Scottish Government priorities and not local community-based priorities or council-based priorities. So what we've had recently, I'll just give you a quick example in North Lanarkshire. The rollout of what's called 1140 hours, which was expanded childcare for kids, preschool kids. And it came with a whole range of funding restrictions and requirements about what was to be delivered locally. And things have changed now. And we're now looking at hundreds of early years practitioners in North Lanarkshire facing redundancy because there's no money anymore. The ring fencing has been, the funding has gone, therefore the ring fencing has gone, and these flagship policies from Scottish Government just can't be delivered at a local level. And there's so much of that we're looking at now, what has been a sustained cuts agenda for decades. We've had austerity after austerity after austerity, all of these measures, reduced funding, pay awards are never fully funded. Councils attempt to budget for them, and I'm not going to be 100% sympathetic to some of our councils, because I think they could and should do more, but I do feel quite sorry for them. It's my background, local government. I am shocked at the decimation of local services, and I just think we need to face up to the reality of this. A lot of people are resistant to what they see as tax increases because they think they don't get much value for money. Well, believe me, if you wanted your bin uplifted weekly on a private basis, you'd be looking at a bill of £2,000. I don't need to go into what a private school might cost you if you decided to send your kids there to be educated. And there is no substitute for social care and social work particularly, because it doesn't really exist beyond the public sector. So you can't buy it in the way that you might do with other services. So I just think they are absolutely the poor relation. So my view would be I'd want every single one of these tax measures enacted. I'd want every one of these powers, if they can legislate, if they can enact them, in place in order to increase public funding. I mean, we've been through the most extraordinary year in terms of pay awards, and many of our workers, our members, have seen pay awards like they've never seen before, but they've certainly never seen inflation like this before. So my aspirations would have to be fully funded public services, a restoration of all of those services that we've lost. Every one of us could walk down the street and see something they'd had, a library, a community-based centre, some kind of leisure facility, or even the height of the grass, because it's only cut as and when, or only cut 3 feet in from the pavement. So I'd want to see a lot of that stopped. And I think the thing we've not mentioned, but I say every single time, certainly you and I meet, Linda, is about the National Care Service. If Scottish Government can find upwards of £1 billion to put in place some kind of structural reform to try and address all the social care pressures we've got, and bear in mind that doesn't include uplifting the wages for the workers within that service, and does include outsourcing about 75,000 of them, then there's £1 billion straight off the bat that could be used elsewhere. I think particularly within the NHS, which is just staggeringly out of control in terms of waiting times and patient care. And again, just for context, we're talking big bucks here in terms of a lot of these tax powers and areas that we can look at. But 1% of the NHS pay bill, 1%, is £112 million. So an inflationary pay award within the NHS probably takes out the £1 billion I've just talked about within the National Care Service. But where do we find the rest of the money? And I just think that it's absolutely a time now for us to be looking at what do we need as a society? What is the social contract that we're signing up to in Scotland? What do we demand in terms of public services? And I think we need to demand better. It's one of the very stark statements the STUC have been campaigning under, which is Scotland demands better. And if we're going to demand better, we need to demand that people pay for things, and services cost money. Taxation is the fairest way to fund services. And I completely get that wealth taxes are difficult, but God, we're Scottish, we do it all the time. We need to buckle down. There's been far too many reviews of various forms of taxation, not least the council tax, that are gathering dust on shelves. There's been about 3 in recent times. So Hamza Youssef, this is day one, tomorrow is day one. Get your sleeves rolled up and get the dust blown off some of this research, and let's start doing the difficult things, raising the money, provide this type of services that Scotland demands. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. I mean, I think bringing it back to what does it actually mean for people on the ground, often when we think in policy terms, we can talk about fully funded public services, and, you know, actually thinking what does that look like in people's communities is the important part. You know, what are those services at the end of your street that are no longer there in those empty buildings that we have around us? But as you say, some of this is actually feels aspirational, but it shouldn't be. You know, it's what people demand, and it is what they deserve in their communities. And the points about austerity as well. I mean, the STUC, along with our affiliated members, has long campaigned for better funding across Scotland generally, but particularly for local authorities who have been hardest hit by this. And there's some kind of, you know, magician's trick goes on between local authorities and the Scottish Government as they pass an unseen amount of money, supposedly back and forward, that they all claim that each other doesn't have. You know, so I think it's quite incredible when we look back at that, and we constantly hear from local authorities they've no money, and yet Scottish Government will say, oh, we've given them all the money they need. You know, and as you say, too often it is ring-fenced, or it goes into some other box that therefore can't be accessed. Ros, if I can come to you next, I mean, reflecting on what we've heard from Howard and from the rest of our panel, I mean, what do you think that needs to happen when we talk about investment in public services and pay? You know, what should we be doing more widely about the cost of living crisis as well in Scotland?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. And can I just start by really thanking Howard for the work he did on this research paper. It's not over-egging things to say that report really allowed us to, you know, switch up the narrative ahead of the budget this year. In the context of a very serious cost of living crisis, we were able to really challenge the Scottish Government and open up a debate that for a long time has really needed us to kick down the door on a debate about progressive taxation, and about the Scottish Government not hiding behind its lack of powers or trying to blame Westminster, but actually owning the powers that it has, and you know, really pushing the boundaries with them on what do you have the power to do, and what can you do now, or what might take you a few years, but let's get started now. because what we see often from the Scottish Government is a lot of rhetoric. We hear about the wellbeing economy, we hear about fair work, we hear about just transitions and you know, a lot of really nice language about, you know, aspirational things, but they love to tell us that that can't happen until we achieve independence. So we were really keen to look at the powers that exist right now and how we could push the envelope in those powers and make it a debate more about political will rather than about political ability. And I think that paper was really, really successful in enabling us to do that. And I do think, as you said, we did achieve some success through the budget with that and pushing back at a time when actually we were facing calls from the right in the country to raise taxes, to lower taxes for certain groups and to cut back. I think we managed to push the debate slightly in the other direction. We certainly didn't get everything we wanted, but we did create that space for the debate. And I think it is absolutely necessary right now that we have that debate, that the need for that debate is still absolutely crucial. And, you know, we actually spent the early months of this year pushing the Deputy First Minister, who was covering the finance job in the Scottish Government, for a meeting, for a proper response to our taxation paper, and then a series of meetings to look at the longer term work that needed to be done on some of the areas like wealth tax, like having a re-evaluation of property and land, and looking at the preparatory work that needs to be done to make some of these longer term progressive changes to our taxation system. What's been interesting is that the tax debate has continued into the SNP leadership race, and we saw Humza Yousaf, who, you know, dependent on the Parliament say, is likely to become our next First Minister, making some very, very key last minute commitments as part of his election campaign to looking at wealth tax, looking at property taxation and other areas, and also actually looking at a tax for those above 75,000, which looked suspiciously like some of the measures that were in the STUC's taxation document. So that was welcome to see that it had dominated some of the thinking in the leadership debate, and we'll be holding our feet to the fire in the period ahead to make sure that we get some of those measures implemented. But I mean, if you're looking at what needs to happen, there's a million things that need to happen. We did have a plan that we were pushing to government, the People's Plan for Action, and, you know, real pay rises for all public sector workers are crucial, and that's not over yet. We certainly did better than most workers across the UK public sector, but we still have some workers in our public sector up here that are waiting for a pay rise, still waiting since last April, not least some of the Scottish Government's own employees and others across civil service. We still have you know, to go back and look at, you know, even if inflation does go down, we still have seen significant pay rises for ordinary working people across Scotland, and the pay rises we did get didn't meet inflation at the time. So, you know, we're still behind. It's still a real terms pay cut that we're dealing with, and we'll be back for more this year in many cases. But we also need to look, as Tracy said, at local government. That's a crucial area because it's the local government services that tend to support some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And it has been utterly starved and stripped back over the last decade or so. So if you're serious about, you know, supporting people who are being worst affected by the cost of living, you have to fund local government. It's absolutely right, the comments that were made about health as well. That's a key area for us. We have powers over social security, and we do need to make sure that the government meets some of the commitments to get money to those most in need through the powers they have over social security. We need to be securing some longer term commitments around rent regulation and rent caps to protect ordinary workers who are finding it increasingly difficult to get on the property ladder. We need to be taxing the rich and doing everything we're talking about tonight. Free school meals is another big area that we should be looking at. public transport, publicly controlled transport, our trains, our buses, you know, under public ownership, but we also need to invest in them. You're going to get the kind of railway that you're prepared to pay for. And I want to see the kind of railway where ordinary people can use it because the fares are affordable and the trains are plentiful and we're providing good employment for the people that work there. Warm homes that are retrofitted, a public energy company to take forward the changes that we need to our energy systems, you know, taking back control of some of our energy systems. We've had opportunities to do some of that, and we've really missed the boat with some of the initiatives we've seen, like the Scotland initiative, where we sold off, you know, rights to the private sector really on the cheap, when we should have been taking a public stake in some of that work for the offshore energy. Infrastructure around care, you know, care to me is just another, this is essential infrastructure, just like roads and rail and everything else is. So, you know, childcare, adult care, these things need invested in, they need delivered properly. I won't go into the National Care Service too much because I think, Tracy, you said it all. It needs to be fit for purpose. It shouldn't have a profit element in it, and people should get paid appropriately for delivering high standards of care. And we should be enforcing fair work in this country. If we're serious about a wellbeing economy, that's what needs to happen. I know that's a long, long wish list. And I also know that you're not going to be able to deliver on any of that unless you have more progressive taxation. There is enough wealth in our economy. We're just leaving it in too few hands. And so you can't be a government that likes to talk about all these things if you're not prepared to have the difficult conversation about what we're going to do to raise the money to pay for it. So, you know, I think there's some difficult conversations ahead, but we really are mobilising people to demand better. And I think that's where we're at our most effective as a trade union movement in Scotland, when we're on the case, demanding better, and actually coming up with some of the solutions about how these aspirations can be effectively delivered.
Thank you, Ros, and thanks for giving us a summary of the, as I say, what was our people's plan for action. You know, when we put that together last year, it was looking at the cost of living crisis, when we had a conference across Scotland, bringing together people across Scotland with working with our partners through the Poverty Alliance. And when we had over 120 delegates along to that last summer and developed that programme out of that to try and say this isn't just about people at work, this is beyond that, it's also about housing and transport and the other needs around us, and that's why we put that together. And you know, those things will be part of an ongoing discussion with government. And you know, whilst the SNP, I think it would be fair to say, have gone through an engulfing crisis, for that there are other opportunities for other people. And you know, we've seen maybe a shift in the discussion that would have been there previously around tax. And we'll have to kind of, you know, move to try and make sure that we can make the best of that while we've still got an opportunity to do so. I was going to come back to David, and I had a question. One of the things that's up for review at the moment is actually around the fiscal framework, which is the mechanism between the UK government and the Scottish government, and how it sees that our funding is actually decided. And I wonder what you thought about really about the fiscal framework and the potential implications for the Scottish budget if Scotland was to introduce significant revenue raising tax as outlined in some of this report.
Thanks, yeah, good question. So the when significant tax devolution first happened in 2016, a new fiscal framework for Scotland was established. What that does is set out a bunch of rules about how tax devolution in Scotland is operationalised. So it includes rules on things like how the block grant is adjusted, what ability the Scottish government has to borrow or to use cash management tools to smooth revenue volatility or forecast error. So it's a sort of techie type of document. And when the first fiscal framework was established in 2016, the UK and Scottish governments agreed that they would review it in 2021 in time for a sort of potentially reformed arrangement for 2022. As you can imagine, for a whole bunch of reasons, the review's been delayed. It hasn't really happened. So nothing has really changed. But I think the key point really in answer to your question is, although there are aspects of the fiscal framework that are really sort of slightly complicated and give really sort of head scratching type problems to nerdy people like me to think about. The basic message is, if the Scottish government implements a tax increase of the sort that we've been talking about here that are outlined in Howard's report, then yes, the additional revenues from that policy do boost the Scottish budget relative to a position where the policy was unchanged. So, you know, if the Scottish government adds a penny to income tax, the additional revenue, of course, it flows to the Scottish budget. Where things get complicated is if you do an alternative comparison and you say, well, is the Scottish budget better off than it would have been if tax devolution had never happened in the first place? And that can sometimes give you a different answer, because what's relevant there is also how the revenues from a devolved tax in Scotland have grown over time relative to how the equivalent revenues in the rest of the UK have grown over time. Because after tax devolution, Scotland no longer gets a share of the growth in revenues from the rest of the UK for a tax that has been devolved. So you can have a situation, as we have had for a few years in Scotland, whereby although tax policy changes have boosted the Scottish budget relative to those tax policy changes not having been introduced, the Scottish budget is only a little bit better off than it would have been if tax devolution hadn't happened at all, because the Scottish economy has grown a bit more slowly, and Scotland's no longer getting that share of the revenues from the rest of the UK that would have. So it's that, you know, there is a sort of complication about what you want to compare against, which sometimes gives answers that, you know, politicians can sort of spin in all kinds of wonderful ways. But, you know, ultimately, if the question is, does the Scottish government benefit from a tax policy increase or change that it implements, then yes is the answer. Apologies if you can hear a 6-year-old screaming in the background.
No, it's a good addition. Thank you. But thanks for that explanation, because I know that it is quite complicated, but it's incredibly complicated looking at the fiscal framework. And I know that the review that's ongoing just now, as you say, the timing of it potentially is, well, you know, there's been stopped for a variety of reasons, not least to say because of the pandemic and a change in UK government and Prime Minister fairly regularly. But, you know, for them to do it now, I'm not sure really what difference it's going to make to the current framework, considering what we might want from it in a, you know, sometime in the future, should there be a change in UK government. Moving on from that, I suppose just thinking, I mean, Howard, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to come back on just now, just in terms of the things you've heard that you might want to comment on briefly.
The only thing I would say, just one additional observation based on other work I've done, the points that Tracy and Ros in particular made about underfunding of public services in Scotland at the moment. I mean, you've seen that the tax package, the recommended tax package is very progressive. If the money from that was used to increase investment in public services, or increase on kind of frontline services, just, you know, either salaries or, you know, other aspects of the service. Some of the work I've done for kind of TUC in London in particular on the distribution impacts of in-kind public service spending. So when you spend more money on the health service, social care in particular, education, early years, they're very progressive outcomes in terms of like the profile of the people using those services most. Almost everything. The only kind of partial exception is, at least in England, is rail travel, because commuters tend to have on average kind of higher incomes than the population. But I'm not sure if that, I haven't looked at that specifically in Scotland, but bus services are very progressive, and other things like social housing. So basically, if you do increase, if you do get the revenues to increase public services, there's a really good kind of distributional payoff in terms of helping some of the people who suffered most from from repeated bouts of austerity. So I think that's important.
Thanks, Howard. That's important to draw out, and it comes back to your earlier point about dealing with some of the gender inequality as well across the system. If we were looking at some of the progressive taxes, and indeed women tend to be in lower paid income jobs and often are much higher users of public services as well. So you get that double kind of hit there. And the work that's done in Scotland, particularly by the Scottish Women's Budget Group, they always say that, you know, if you put money into women's pockets, then they will spend it locally. And that's, you know, that's the best way that you can get money back in. And while the Scottish Government are quite right to focus on things like free school meals as a way to help families, and to look at how they can potentially bring in, you know, increase the Scottish Child Payment that they've brought in. There are things they can do, but we would still argue that complementary, or indeed importantly, on top of those things, paying the lower paid workers across public services is the way to get money into those families, into those households, and to make sure that we can kind of address that in the most direct way. Indeed, social care being one of the big employers. And I know that in the chat, Linda Wilson from Unite has also mentioned about, you know, third sector social care and what some of the difficulties are there that people are being faced with, again, about pay rises. If anyone's got any questions specifically for anyone on the panel, then we can just stick them in the chat. But one that we've got already, which I don't know if we've got any thoughts about, which David, you might have, which was any background on tax evasion in Scotland, both at a company level, but our company executive level. I don't know if you'd know that. I know certainly it's one of the things that's talked about when we talk about increasing taxes. People say, oh, but people will always get around them. If you're wealthy, you can have accountants, you can, you know, get around these things. And to some extent, that is obviously true. We knew that tax evasion is a massive issue in Britain and doesn't get the same kind of scrutiny as indeed sanctions and benefits fraud gets from the people that are involved in that. But what we would say as well is that the idea that everyone's going to leave Scotland simply because we put up income tax, the majority of people that we're talking about, except for the income tax bracket, when you're talking about new wealth taxes, many of the people that own the land and buildings don't live here. Many of the people are abroad already. So, you know, we'd need to think about how does that materialise? What does that look like when you're talking about trying to anchor your wealth taxes around properties and services, but also about those that may choose to evade tax? If you have any thoughts on that, would be helpful.
Probably I'm not aware of any Scottish specific stats on evasion. I mean, I think the question is about sort of avoidance. So I guess avoidance is sort of reducing tax liabilities through sort of exploiting the rules in a sort of technically legitimate way. There's clearly one risk is that if you have divergence of tax policy within the UK, then potentially there is greater scope for avoidance than already exists at a UK level on some things. So, for example, on income tax, I mean, I personally, I don't think there's much scope for avoidance in the sense of people moving physically between Scotland and the rest of the UK. But the fact that it's non-savings and non-dividend income that's devolved, and savings and dividend income remains reserved, means that in theory, the incentives that some people in Scotland might have to convert income from earned income into some form of dividend income that's taxed at the UK level may be slightly greater at the margins. I mean, I think all of that's pretty marginal, and so far the work that HMRC has done hasn't identified any significant evidence of income tax avoidance as a result of the divergence in income tax that's been seen so far. I think it is one of the reasons why I think there are some risks around things like a wealth tax as well, if that's introduced sort of in one part of the UK. Presumably a wealth tax, if it operated at a Scottish level, we would use the existing identification of Scottish taxpayers that we have through the income tax system to sort of identify who is a Scottish taxpayer, and therefore those people are liable for a wealth tax in some way. But I do think there are probably ways in which by putting wealth into a trust, for example, trusts are notoriously difficult to sort of pin down the geographical locations of. There are ways in which you potentially lose some revenue through that type of behaviour. But I mean, I do think those things are generally, probably my view is that they're not as, there's a tendency to exaggerate the scale of those things, but I do think there are some issues there.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. There was another question came up, David, for you, which was how can we get clarity on the Scottish Government's ability to implement a local wealth tax? David may be suggesting that basically it's likely, but not that it's likely not possible. Is that quite definitive, or should we be doing more work around that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think so. I think you'd have probably quite a hard job of convincing the UK government that a wealth tax was a local tax. I think they would basically want to be seeing some evidence that it was a tax that was collected, controlled by local government. And I think in practice that would be, you know, if you think about the sorts of systems that you'd need to set up, that seems to me to be quite a challenging thing to think about. But if you wanted to go about it at a Scottish level, well, there is an agreed process that the Scottish and UK governments have. It's one of the things that's sort of set out in this fiscal framework I talked about before. There is in principle an agreed process whereby the Scottish government can request to introduce a new tax. The Scottish government hasn't tested that process yet, but the Welsh government has tested that process and found that it has created quite a few challenges, let's put it that way. And partly as a result of that, the Scottish government is a little bit reticent about testing that process itself, and is probably slightly skeptical that it would get very far with that process. But having said all of that, I do think for the wealth tax, that, I mean, there's the constitutional questions, but I think those administrative questions, thinking about actually what kind of systems of self-assessment you need to set up, and who's doing those, and who's collecting the information, and who's ensuring compliance. I think those are big challenges to think about, and those are the bigger things, and those are certainly the things that you need to sort of start thinking about even before you get onto the constitutional stuff, in a way.
Thank you. Thank you. It covers it. I was just going to bring Howard back in. Howard, there's a couple of questions here that I think would be helpful. Would councils have any local discretion over a proportional property tax? And again, that's a week for debate, but you might have some ideas of what the model might be there. And how do increases in landfill tax impact on councils?
Well, on the local discretion, I would think that it would probably, for it to be a proper local tax, they'd have to have some discretion. I mean, the distribution analysis I did kind of assume uniform national rates of proportional property tax, but in practice, I think there'd be some variation in the rates, just as there is for kind of council tax at the moment. It's just easier to get the distribution results out more simply if you assume that everybody's kind of paying the same rate. So yeah, basically I would expect there to be some local variation in the rest. Landfill tax and councils, I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, that's a really interesting question that I'd have to kind of look at what's actually been done on that. I'm not sure.
I think landfill tax is a Scottish government tax rather than a local tax.
Yeah, but I think the question was what the impact on councils would be, rather than of actually increase.
Oh, I see. Of the revenues. Yeah, well, that would be a decision for the government, I suppose.
And Howard, we talked just there about tax avoidance, and I know you did cover that in your research. You put in some factor for that, didn't you?
Yeah, that's but on the the income tax assumptions are basically in line with the Scottish government publishes a ready reckoner, which I think is produced jointly with the OBR, of the impact of the revenue from raising tax at like higher rate or top rate, and the top rate takes into account in particular kind of quite a lot of avoidance. That's why the revenue from raising the top rate in itself is only kind of a few million for each, a few million pounds a year for each percentage point. On wealth, I used previous research from the Wealth Tax Commission at the LSE, and there was also some research from University of Greenwich on proportion of the avoidance percentage, and made some sort of reasonably kind of mid-range assumptions. I think about 35% of the revenue would be avoided or something like that. It could be worse than that, but it might be less than that, particularly at the sort of 1 to 2 million bracket. It's hard to say. These estimates are a bit of an educated guess, really, in terms of how much avoidance we think there'd be.
Thanks, Howard. That's very useful to hear. Another question here, which again, for anyone on the panel, this question is about from Bill Ramsey about the levy tax on second homes. Do you mean, Bill, that you wanted just to know a bit more about that? Maybe, Howard, if you can explain what we've put forward there, and if there's any more. Bill Noyes saying yes, I can see him. So yeah, a bit more about the tax on second homes.
Yeah, well, the main second homes tax that I modelled was the proportional property tax, like replacing council tax with proportional property tax. The system that I modelled was a 0.6 percentage a year for primary residences. For people with second homes, the charge would be double that, 1.2% a year. So it's quite a significant kind of premium that you pay if you own a second home on these proposals. So it's kind of, that it's designed to make sure that people who own second homes are kind of paying quite a bit more, basically.
Thank you. And I mean, that again helps us to think about some of the wider issues around housing in Scotland generally. I know there's a couple of people on the call specifically that have been doing a lot of campaigning around rents, and indeed about housing more generally. One of the questions that we wanted to ask as well, and it's in here from Francis, which is, are there examples of other countries implementing wealth taxes? And I suppose I should maybe say, have they done that successfully, or what barriers have they had? Obviously, there's political barriers to that, but maybe from an implementation point of view as well, David or Howard, if you've got any comments on that.
There have been some, there have been some. I mean, it's been a kind of periodical thing, really, in that some countries have introduced them and then taken them out again and then maybe reintroduced them. France had one for quite a long time. Sweden had one for quite a long time. Several European countries, I think. I mean, it certainly seems to be something that's possible to do. Sometimes there's been, relatively high rates of avoidance. So there's some design issues, I think. It's true that the amount raised from wealth taxes, if you look at across OECD countries as a whole, wealth taxes at the moment as a proportion of GDP aren't sort of anywhere near as high as income taxes, for example. But, people often talk about the need to kind of shift more in the direction of wealth taxes and away from income, or at least to supplement income. There's sometimes more going on at the local level in terms of local property taxes in countries like the US. So, property wealth, some countries have kind of higher taxation on that. So that's an interesting kind of area to look at.
Thank you, David. Did you have any reflections on that as well? Other comparative.
I agree with all of that. I think there are, although there's a case for saying, a really strong case for saying we should be moving more towards wealth taxes. On the whole, the direction has been for fewer countries to have a wealth tax in the last couple of decades, but certainly some European countries still do have a wealth tax, and both Spain and Switzerland have a devolved wealth tax of one form or another, and Switzerland also has a devolved inheritance tax as well.
Thank you. And we've also got comments here from Mick as well, who's quite rightly pointing out some of the flaws there might be in governance models around payment for when we've got publicly owned companies as well, and pointing that out specifically, obviously, about our transport service in Scotland, which I think we would be pleased to see that the government has taken back into public control. But obviously the governance and the rates around payment for people there has led, yes, very much to double standards when workers' wages are not at the levels that they should be. Has anyone got any further questions? I know we've got a couple more that we wanted to reflect on, noted down. I'll just see if there's any more in the chat. Coming back, I suppose, to Tracy, I would probably ask, Tracy, when we think about, you quite rightly pointed out some of the problems that we see across Scotland, but at the local authority funding particularly, but, your work goes beyond that, I know, but thinking specifically about local authorities, if we were to speak to the new First Minister, which we will in the next week or so, hopefully, about what needs done immediately, and it's a hard call because there's so many things that need done, as Ross said, about, a plan for action. What would you say would be the priorities, thinking about funding, thinking about the issues that there are in front of us that your members are struggling with? What would be the priorities, the top few things that you would want him to address?
I think not necessarily in this order, but the interesting one is that Hamza Yousaf was the health minister going into this election period, and he pledged that he would resolve the NHS pay far more quickly than had been the case in previous years. And to be fair to him, he did. And I think I need to be saying to him very, very quickly, you need to move into local government mode now. There can be no delay. You can't wait. You cannot allow the rubbish to pile up in the streets the way that it did last year, and local government workers to be starved of basic earning requirements. They are low paid. Half of the workforce earn less than £25,000. There is no offer on the table. There is always an annual spat between us and COSLA, and last year it took Scottish Government intervention to resolve that. So get your sleeves rolled up. Let's talk local government pay, and it has to be meaningful, and it has to be in the context of what they paid the health workers. Any less, no good. So I think pay has got to be a priority, and obviously we represent in a range of sectors. And if I even just look at Scotland's colleges at the moment, they're balloting currently because they've only been offered 2%. I mean, it's just scandalous that we're continually seeing all of this. I think my next big priority would be to say, would you kick that National Care Service off the park? You've paused the bill. It's a disaster. It will not deliver a vision for Scotland's care. So get it sorted. Get into meaningful dialogue with us. We have a vision for this. We're clear about what needs to happen. Sectoral bargaining is part of that. We need to see our care workers. It's not part of the bill, but it's very much part of that scene. We need to see the basic pay for care workers up at least £15 an hour. Again, scandalous at the rates of pay that they're receiving currently. So we need to see some progress on that. And I think my third big priority within the public sector has to be the staffing crisis in the NHS. Our members are absolutely burnt out. There is no two ways about it. They are leaving the National Health Service in their droves. Agency levels are sky high because people have left and nobody wants to work umpteen hours a week for the money that they're receiving. And there needs to be some proper workforce planning in there. None of this happened by accident or by surprise. It has been very, very poorly planned and resourced for years. And those chickens have come home to roost. So we just cannot get waiting lists down. We can't get ambulance waiting times down. We can't get people seen who are suffering now, dying, frankly, bluntly, because they're not getting the treatment that they deserve. So some proper workforce planning. And that sits fairly and squarely at Hamza's door. He might have moved on to the bigger job, a better job maybe, but he's left that behind for somebody else to pick up. So we need a really strong player in there in terms of this cabinet reshuffle. I'm very, very interested to see who picks that brief up and what they do with it. But they have to be the absolute priorities, and I don't want to diminish in any way the work that others do in schools, in the railways, across the whole spectrum of public services. But we live in these communities. We deserve better than this. We deserve workers being properly paid that are not at risk of redundancy and leaving. We deserve to be able to access the NHS service, and we deserve a social care service, a national social care service that's actually fit for purpose. And I think the trade unions are key to all of that. Talk to us. We're full of it. We always have been. We've got loads of ideas. We've got, that whole mantra, but if only they'd spoken to us first. Well, come and speak to us first. Come and ask. We know we've got the experience. Take us seriously. It's Mick's point about boards, but it's more than that. There needs to be a regular dialogue. It needs to start as soon as he takes up that post. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And David, I suppose if you were to look at the new government, the new cabinet that will be formed, what would you think should be their priorities when they look at funding for across Scotland?
Well, I think I'm technically now, I'm no longer an academic. I'm actually a civil servant, and I'm not really allowed to answer questions like that. But I mean, I think clearly there's my sense is this report was set up, in particular to look at the sort of revenue raising challenges in relation to the very current cost of living issues. But clearly, there's a real sort of long-term structural set of fiscal pressures and challenges here. So I hope I think the report definitely will have a sort of longevity in terms of highlighting some of the options to look at. I think for me, I think the one that we really need to try and crack, I've already I've broken what I said I wasn't going to do. The one that's very clearly within the devolved control of the Scottish government, and we've been talking about this for decades, and I think everybody knows the case and the technical issues around that is clearly council tax, and really have to work out why reform is such a barrier. But it feels like we've got to move away from, somebody else has already said this, away from the technical analysis, and it's got to be a sort of hearts and minds campaign. I think something like that to really make the case and build momentum for that. Yes, but ignore that I said that. I'm not supposed to say things like that.
Thank you, David. Like many civil servants, when they're asked for their opinion, they say, "I can't possibly tell you." However, so no, we really appreciate that, and I know that you've moved roles recently, but it's your expertise has been invaluable to us throughout this project. I'm just going to come to Ros last, actually, because I think we've kind of run out of questions right now and we're just coming to the end of our evening. But I want to say a huge thanks to everyone for taking part this evening, particularly for Tracy, to David, and for Howard for giving up their time, and for Howard for taking forward our report. And as you can see, there's a lot of interest in it still. It's got a lot of mileage to go. It really focuses on some of the inequalities that are inherent in our tax system, and that's what we want to pursue. And we will be using it. It's the figures might change as time moves on, but I think the ideas that are in there, and that's what we wanted to do, was generate some really creative thinking about this for others to respond to as well. So Ros, just before I finish up, I just wanted to ask you, when we look at the industrial disputes we've had, when we think about the cost of living crisis, these are all moving parts. But in some ways, nothing's really shifted. People were saying the appetite for industrial action is going to drop, inflation is going to come down. We're about to hit our next round of actual negotiations for many of our public sector bodies, even if they have already settled for this year. And when you think about that wider piece about us looking across Scotland and who we've worked with, what do you see as both the priorities for the government to take forward the new cabinet, but also what do you think that everyone on this call and our affiliated trade unions need to do to see change happen?
Thanks, Linda. Well, I won't say any more about priorities because I think colleagues and myself earlier have already outlined some of the key priorities that we need action on. So rather than talking about what we need, you know, I actually think it's crucial that we do talk about what we need to do to get it. And there's no shortcuts here. We actually, as a movement, have to stay angry. We have to keep agitating and organising our members to demand better. And you know, you don't get what you want without a struggle, and nothing worth fighting for was ever won without a struggle. We're talking about demanding fundamental changes to get a fairer economy here, about demanding the redistribution of wealth in our economy to the areas that need it most. That's not going to happen unless we stay angry, we stay in the front foot, and workers and communities are prepared to continue to get organised, come together and make those demands in a really strong and a really loud voice. So we have to continue to highlight the injustices that are out there. There was a great point just made by Bill in the chat there about the amount of money the whisky industry is getting away without paying tax. And that's what I really want, is to have that debate about where is the wealth in our economy and how can we get our hands on it and get our fair share of it. We should be absolutely unapologetic in the demands that we're making, but we also have to be organised and realise that when workers come together, we have real power to make a difference. And actually, nobody else is going to do that for us. We'll have to make the politicians do it. And, you know, ultimately, we have the power of the ballot box. If they're going to continue just to give us the talk and not the action, then we need to do something about that at the ballot box and keep all of our politicians on their toes. So, you know, we will very much continue to talk to government. We'll be chatting their door. We'll want to build a very strong working relationship with them, but we will be uncompromising in the demands that we're making for ordinary working people, because we put a lot into this economy. It's time we started getting our fair share of the wealth.
Thank you, Ros. It was excellent points for us to come to a conclusion on. I mean, just one reflection on the chat as well. It's just been mentioned as well that PCS have won a minimum of £15 an hour. And I think that that's for Parliament staff in Scotland and maybe in other areas, I'm not sure. So I think, you know, the aspiration is there amongst workers, and it's quite right. And that was some of the lowest paid staff, I think, working across Scottish Government. That will also cover, because it's, you know, it's a variety of people that work within the Parliament. So, you know, we know that things can be funded. We've shown now how it can be done. We've got a plan for what we need the government to do. Thank you to Paul McLennan, who's on the call as well, one of our MSPs, who is saying that he's willing to take forward some of these discussions for us. I know earlier this evening we were joined by colleagues from the Labour Party and the Green Party. Maggie Chapman, my MSP, was on the call. Katie Clark was on the call, and Mercedes Villalba. So I just want to say we've had a very successful cross-party support for our tax seminar this evening. And Howard, indeed, you've managed to get that presentation across to 4 of our MSPs directly from 3 different parties. So thank you for doing that. Thanks to everyone. As I say, we'll continue this conversation. We'll be taking it forward with the First Minister, and we're quite right to think about the visioning of what we want. You know, when you hear somebody talk about public services and how libraries have closed and things have gone, is it actually that radical to think that these places should be open and should be there for us? Is it that radical to think that our health service shouldn't have the waiting times? We would think that a lot of this is common sense. And often we talk about radical taxes or a radical difference, but actually maybe it's just common sense, and that's the way that we need to start thinking about it, to mainstream this conversation and to make sure that politicians get more on board and we can make it happen. So thank you to everyone, and as I say, we'll be in touch again about taking this work forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.